I was sitting in my cozy living room with my morning coffee, watching the local news coverage of my son and daughter-in-law's mysterious vehicle theft, while they frantically called every towing company, impound lot, and police station in 3 counties trying to understand how their brand-new $78,000 Cadillac Escalade had been legally seized, sold at auction, and the proceeds donated to charity in a single week, finally understanding that sometimes the family members who abandon a 70-year-old woman on Interstate 95 at midnight during a thunderstorm are about to discover they just left behind the wrong retired Department of Motor Vehicles supervisor with 47 years of experience in vehicle registration law and a contact list that includes every towing contractor, auction house, and DMV official in the state of Florida. Before we begin, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been abandoned by family members who treated you like a burden, only to discover they had seriously underestimated your ability to fight back? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who think a senior citizen is helpless and disposable are about to find out they just disrespected someone with nearly 5 decades of expertise in vehicle laws, title transfers, and the precise legal procedures required to make a car disappear forever through completely legitimate channels. This story is about the storm-soaked April night when I realized that my own son Michael, the child I raised alone after his father's death, put through college with every overtime hour I could work at the DMV, supported through his early marriage struggles, and helped establish his successful Miami construction business by using my government connections to navigate licensing and permit requirements, had been systematically treating me like an inconvenient obligation while planning to use my expertise for his benefit, without ever showing me basic human respect or consideration. When I discovered that the son I'd sacrificed everything for, invested my career reputation in, and trusted with my most vulnerable moments, had been quietly treating me like a liability to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished, all while enjoying full access to the government connections and regulatory expertise I'd spent decades building to help his business thrive in Florida's complex construction industry. My name is Dorothy Elena Vasquez, and at 70 years old, I thought I'd found the perfect balance between supporting my son's ambitious construction business while maintaining my own dignity and independence in my comfortable Coral Gables home, just 30 minutes from his downtown Miami office. For 4 years, this arrangement had seemed like the ideal solution for a widowed mother who wanted to remain close to family while continuing to use her decades of DMV and regulatory expertise to help navigate the complex licensing, permitting, and vehicle management requirements that came with running a successful construction company in Miami-Dade County. The business consulting arrangement had been Michael's idea, a practical solution that would allow me to help manage his fleet of construction vehicles, commercial driver licensing issues, and regulatory compliance challenges while also ensuring I had purpose and intellectual engagement during my retirement years. As someone who'd spent 47 years working for the Florida Department of Motor Vehicles, rising from entry-level clerk to regional supervisor of vehicle registration and title services for South Florida, I'd understood exactly how to structure business vehicle operations to provide maximum efficiency while maintaining proper legal compliance and minimizing costly regulatory violations. What I hadn't understood was that my son, Michael Antonio Vasquez, and his wife, Rebecca Martinez Vasquez, had been viewing my regulatory expertise and government connections not as evidence of my continued value and competence, but as convenient services they could exploit while treating me with the kind of casual disrespect typically reserved for hired help, rather than family members who'd made their success possible. The Coral Gables home where I'd been living since Roberto's death had become both my sanctuary and my strategic operations center, though I hadn't realized the latter's significance until much later. The modest 3-bedroom house in the historic district had been strategically chosen for its proximity to Michael's construction sites and its accessibility to the government offices where I'd maintained professional relationships for decades, allowing me to stay involved in meaningful regulatory work while remaining available to help with the increasingly complex vehicle and licensing management that had become my primary contribution to our family's business success. From my converted home office, surrounded by decades of Florida vehicle code manuals, DMV regulation updates, and contact databases that most people spent entire careers trying to build, I'd been quietly managing the complex regulatory requirements that had kept Michael's construction business operating smoothly, while avoiding the costly violations and compliance issues that destroyed many companies in Florida's heavily regulated construction industry. My expertise wasn't just theoretical knowledge from textbooks. It was practical, hands-on understanding of how Florida's vehicle registration, commercial licensing, and regulatory enforcement systems actually worked in real-world business situations. After 4.5 decades working within these systems, I'd developed relationships with supervisors, investigators, and enforcement officials throughout the state who knew my reputation for competence and integrity. The path that had led me to that home office, armed with regulatory expertise that most business owners paid thousands of dollars to access through consultants, had begun 53 years earlier when I'd walked into the Hialeah DMV office as a nervous 17-year-old high school graduate, desperate for steady work that would help support my family, while I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life. Florida in 1971 had been a completely different world from the digital government services that dominated the industry today. Everything had been done with paper forms, carbon copies, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made or broken careers based on a single misfiled document or incorrectly processed registration. It had been a system that rewarded competence, reliability, and the ability to build genuine trust with citizens who were depending on government services to handle their most important transportation and business needs correctly. "Miss Vasquez," the office supervisor had said during my first interview, "working for the DMV requires the kind of person who can handle complex regulatory details while also helping citizens navigate systems they don't understand. Do you think you have the temperament for that kind of responsibility?" My answer had been immediate and confident. "Sir, my father worked construction for 20 years and never missed a day because he understood that other people depended on him doing his job correctly. I understand that government service is about helping people navigate important systems that affect their daily lives, and I take that responsibility very seriously." The starting position had been as a clerk processing basic vehicle registrations, earning $98 per week while learning every aspect of Florida vehicle law, from title transfers to commercial licensing to regulatory enforcement procedures. But what had distinguished me from other entry-level employees had been my genuine fascination with the complexity of regulatory systems and my determination to understand not just how to process paperwork, but why vehicle laws existed and how different types of registration procedures could be used to help citizens and businesses achieve their transportation goals while maintaining compliance. Within 8 months, I'd been promoted to senior clerk. Within 2 years, I'd moved into commercial vehicle licensing and had begun developing the expertise in business transportation law that would define my entire career. Each promotion had come with additional responsibilities, higher salaries, and increased trust from management who recognized that I was building genuine expertise rather than just putting in time. Dorothy has an intuitive understanding of commercial vehicle regulations that typically takes decades to develop, my supervisor had written in a performance review from 1979. She can analyze a business's transportation needs and immediately identify both opportunities for efficiency and potential compliance problems. Our commercial clients specifically request to work with her because they trust her judgment and appreciate her straightforward communication about regulatory requirements. The 1980s had been a period of enormous growth, both personally and professionally. Roberto and I had married in 1978, bought our first house in Coral Gables in 1980, and had welcomed Michael in 1982, all while I'd been rapidly advancing through the DMV's management hierarchy. By 1987, I'd been promoted to senior commercial vehicle specialist, overseeing commercial licensing operations for a region that included over 15,000 businesses and managing a team of 12 specialists and investigators. The work had been challenging and demanding, requiring 50-hour weeks and constant attention to regulatory changes, enforcement priorities, and individual business needs that required sophisticated understanding of how transportation law affected different industries. But it had also been deeply satisfying, providing the kind of intellectual engagement and professional recognition that had made me one of the most respected vehicle registration specialists in South Florida's competitive government service environment. Commercial vehicle regulation in the 1980s had meant building genuine relationships with business owners who were risking everything to build companies, create jobs, and pursue entrepreneurial dreams that required sophisticated transportation management and regulatory compliance. My role had been to evaluate licensing applications, structure compliance programs, monitor business transportation operations, and provide ongoing regulatory guidance that could make the difference between success and failure for dozens of construction, delivery, and service businesses throughout Miami-Dade County. Mrs. Vasquez understands our business transportation needs better than our own logistics coordinator. The owner of a successful moving company had told my supervisor during a client satisfaction review. She doesn't just process our licensing applications. She helps us plan for fleet expansion, manage driver certification requirements, and structure our vehicle operations in ways that support our long-term business goals while keeping us compliant with all regulatory requirements. By 1995, I'd been promoted to assistant regional supervisor, managing commercial vehicle operations for a territory worth over $200 million in annual business licensing fees and overseeing regulatory compliance relationships with some of South Florida's most successful transportation and construction companies. The position had required not just technical regulatory expertise, but also sophisticated understanding of various industries, economic trends, and enforcement environments that influenced commercial vehicle operations. The promotion to regional supervisor in 2003 had represented the culmination of over 30 years of dedicated professional development and had placed me among the top tier of regulatory executives in Florida's government service system. My responsibilities had included oversight of commercial vehicle licensing policies, mentoring junior staff, and maintaining compliance relationships with the state's most important business transportation operations, many of whom had been working with me for decades and had built their fleet management systems based on guidance I'd provided. Dorothy Vasquez is the kind of government professional who understands that business success and regulatory compliance aren't competing priorities, they're collaborative objectives, the state DMV director had said during my promotion ceremony. She's built her career on genuine expertise, absolute integrity, and unwavering commitment to helping businesses operate safely and legally. Our commercial vehicle division's success over the past 3 decades is directly attributable to her leadership and professional excellence. Throughout my government career, I'd also been building parallel expertise in vehicle title transfers, property law, and enforcement procedures, both through formal training and practical experience managing complex regulatory situations that required understanding of how vehicle ownership, business assets, and legal procedures intersected in real-world scenarios. This combination of commercial vehicle expertise and property transfer knowledge had made me uniquely qualified to help Michael and Rebecca navigate the complex regulatory requirements of building a successful construction business in Miami's expensive and heavily regulated environment. When Michael had graduated from Florida International University in 2010 with a construction management degree, but no practical understanding of how to handle the vehicle licensing, driver certification, and regulatory compliance requirements essential for construction operations, I'd been able to provide guidance that had saved him years of costly mistakes and regulatory violations. When Rebecca had joined the business in 2015 after completing her business administration degree, I'd helped them establish fleet management systems, driver training programs, and regulatory compliance protocols that had allowed them to scale their operations rapidly while maintaining the kind of spotless regulatory record that was essential for securing major construction contracts with government agencies and large Corporations. The consulting arrangement that had become central to their business operations had been my own innovation, developed through decades of experience helping business clients manage complex regulatory relationships between commercial, vehicle operations, driver management, and compliance oversight. I'd understood exactly how to structure their fleet operations to provide maximum efficiency while maintaining proper legal protections and ensuring that all drivers and vehicles met the stringent requirements necessary for construction industry operations. What I'd created was essentially a comprehensive business transportation management system that had allowed Michael and Rebecca to focus on their construction operations while I'd handled the complex logistics of vehicle licensing, driver certification, regulatory compliance, and enforcement liaison that had kept their business operating smoothly without the costly violations and operational disruptions that plagued many construction companies. The primary vehicle management system, established in 2020 through my connections with state and county regulatory officials, had been designed to serve as the central coordination point for managing both fleet operations and driver compliance. Michael's construction trucks, Rebecca's administrative vehicles, and their equipment haulers had all been registered and maintained through systems I'd developed using relationships I'd built with DMV supervisors, inspection officials, and insurance coordinators throughout South Florida. By early 2024, their fleet had grown to include 12 commercial vehicles worth over $450,000, all of them properly licensed, insured, and maintained according to systems I'd designed to ensure compliance, while minimizing operational costs and regulatory risks. My management of these operations had generated an additional $23,000 in cost savings over the previous year alone, demonstrating the value of having someone with professional-level regulatory expertise overseeing business transportation operations. But the vehicle management had been just one component of a much more comprehensive regulatory support system that I'd developed to help Michael and Rebecca's business thrive in Florida's competitive construction industry. I'd also established commercial driver training programs, had created inspection and maintenance schedules that prevented costly violations, had developed emergency response procedures for accidents and regulatory inquiries, and had built relationships with enforcement officials that protected their business from the kind of aggressive investigation and penalty assessment that could destroy construction companies overnight. The total value of the regulatory services I'd been providing for their business had exceeded $35,000 annually in equivalent consulting fees. All of it carefully coordinated and strategically positioned to support both immediate operational needs and long-term business growth. My decades of government experience had allowed me to negotiate favorable terms with regulatory agencies, secure expedited processing for urgent licensing needs, and structure compliance programs that had saved their business thousands of dollars annually in fees, penalties, and missed opportunities. More importantly, my involvement in managing these regulatory operations had allowed Michael and Rebecca to focus entirely on their demanding construction projects without having to worry about the complex vehicle management and regulatory compliance that had become necessary as their business had grown. I'd essentially been serving as their personal regulatory affairs director, providing the kind of sophisticated government relations management that most successful construction companies had to pay substantial fees to obtain from external consultants. That arrangement had also provided me with a sense of purpose and professional engagement that had made retirement much more satisfying than the passive, isolated lifestyle that many people my age had resigned themselves to accepting. Rather than feeling like a burden or an irrelevant old woman, I'd been actively contributing value while maintaining my professional skills and staying connected to the regulatory systems that had defined my career. What I hadn't realized was that Michael and Rebecca had been taking this enormous contribution for granted while gradually developing attitudes toward me that had become increasingly disrespectful and exploitative. They'd been benefiting from professional-level regulatory management worth easily $35,000 annually in equivalent services, but they'd been treating me like an unpaid administrative assistant whose primary value was availability and convenience rather than expertise and competence. The signs of their changing attitude had been subtle at first. Slightly shorter phone calls when I'd had questions about their business needs, less interest in my opinions about regulatory strategies, occasional comments about my age or capabilities. That had seemed like harmless teasing, but had actually reflected deeper assumptions about my declining relevance and value. Over time, these small indicators had accumulated into a pattern of disrespect that had been masked by their continued reliance on my regulatory services. The most painful aspect of their evolving attitude had been the way they'd begun treating my decades of government expertise as somehow less relevant or valuable because it had been developed in an earlier era. Rebecca, in particular, had occasionally made comments about old-school government procedures or traditional regulatory approaches that had implied my knowledge was outdated rather than foundational and enduring. "Dorothy, I appreciate everything you do for us," Rebecca had said during one particularly frustrating conversation about commercial vehicle compliance. "But sometimes I think you're being overly cautious because you learned government procedures when things were different. Michael and I are comfortable with more streamlined approaches that might be more efficient for modern business operations." These conversations had been particularly frustrating because my cautious approach had actually been preventing violations and regulatory problems that could have cost their business tens of thousands of dollars in penalties and operational disruptions. My decades of experience had taught me how to balance efficiency with compliance in ways that had protected their business even during periods of increased enforcement activity that had devastated less experienced operators. The gradual erosion of respect had been accompanied by increasing expectations that I would be available whenever they needed regulatory services, regardless of my own schedule or personal preferences. Phone calls at all hours requesting immediate licensing assistance, last-minute demands to research compliance requirements, and assumptions that I would drop everything to handle urgent regulatory matters had become increasingly common. "Dorothy, I need you to get emergency commercial driver permits for 3 new employees by tomorrow morning," Michael would call to say, without any acknowledgement that I might have other plans or that such requests required considerable time and effort to process correctly through government channels. "We've got a big project starting Monday, so I hope you can handle this today." The casualness of these requests had reflected their assumption that managing their regulatory affairs was my primary responsibility, rather than a valuable service I'd been providing out of family loyalty and professional expertise. They'd been treating me like a personal government liaison rather than a retired regulatory supervisor who'd been voluntarily contributing professional-level services to support their success. Looking back now, I can see that their attitude had been gradually shifting from gratitude and respect to entitlement and assumption, though the change had been so gradual that I'd initially interpreted their increased reliance on my services as evidence of trust and appreciation rather than exploitation and disrespect. But standing in my Coral Gables home that April evening, reviewing the increasingly concerning patterns in their behavior and the mounting evidence that they'd been taking my contributions for granted while treating me with casual disrespect, I was beginning to understand that our family relationship had fundamentally changed, and that Michael and Rebecca's true feelings about my value and my place in their lives were about to be revealed in ways that would shock me to my core. The foundation they'd been taking for granted, my regulatory expertise, my government relationships, my access to licensing systems, and my absolute commitment to their business success, was actually going to become the platform from which I would launch the most comprehensive lesson they'd ever receive about respecting the people who'd invested everything in making their dreams possible. What Michael and Rebecca hadn't anticipated was that their plan to treat me as a convenient resource rather than a valued family member had one fatal flaw. I was actually the person who understood Florida vehicle law better than they ever would, had access to government systems they'd never heard of, and possessed the regulatory knowledge necessary to restructure their entire business transportation operations in ways they'd never see coming. Sometimes the people who think you're just a helpful old lady are about to discover you're actually Someone with the power to make their most valuable business assets disappear through completely legal channels. Michael and Rebecca were about to learn that taking someone's expertise for granted, while treating them with disrespect, was the most expensive mistake they'd ever made in their lives. Standing in my Coral Gables home office that April morning, surrounded by decades of regulatory manuals and contact directories that represented nearly half a century of government service excellence, I needed to understand how I'd reached this point of systematic disrespect from family members who should have been celebrating my contributions rather than exploiting them. But to comprehend the full scope of what was building toward that devastating Freeway incident, you need to know about the life of professional dedication and personal sacrifice I'd built before Michael and Rebecca decided my expertise was something they could take for granted rather than treasure. A life of regulatory innovation, community service, and the kind of government expertise that had made their disrespect both possible and ultimately catastrophic. My journey to that frustrating April morning had begun 70 years earlier, when I'd been born Dorothy Elena Rodriguez, to parents who understood that a woman's education and professional competence were not optional luxuries, but essential foundations for survival and dignity in a world that rarely offered women second chances or easy paths to economic security. And professional respect, my father, Carlos Miguel Rodriguez, had been a foreman for the Miami-Dade County Public Works Department, specializing in infrastructure maintenance projects that had helped build and maintain the roads, bridges, and transportation systems that had supported South Florida's explosive growth throughout the mid-20th century. He'd spent his career understanding complex systems, managing diverse crews, and ensuring that projects worth millions of dollars were completed safely, efficiently, and according to specifications that would keep them functioning reliably for decades. Mia, my father had said during one of our regular Sunday dinner conversations about my future plans, the most important thing you can learn is that competence and reliability are the only real security anyone has in this world. People will always need someone who understands how complex systems work and who can be trusted to handle important responsibilities correctly, especially in government service where citizens depend on us to do our jobs right. My mother, Elena, Maria Rodriguez, had been equally influential in shaping my understanding of what was possible for an educated woman willing to work harder and think more strategically than the people around her. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for a small import business in Little Havana, while also managing our household finances with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had kept our family financially stable despite the economic uncertainties that had characterized the 1950s and 1960s in immigrant communities. Carita, my mother had told me during my high school years, never let anyone convince you that being good with paperwork and understanding government procedures is somehow inappropriate for women. The women I know who have the most security and independence are those who understand how official systems work, can manage complex regulatory situations, and refuse to depend on other people for their professional survival. The Rodriguez household had been intellectually stimulating and professionally focused in ways that had prepared me for the government career I would eventually build. Dinner conversations had regularly included discussions of municipal management, regulatory compliance, infrastructure planning, and the importance of building systems that could function reliably under pressure while serving diverse community needs fairly and efficiently. By age 16, I'd already been helping my father review public works contracts, had developed sophisticated understanding of government procedures and regulatory requirements, and had begun to understand that successful public service required much more than just following rules. It required strategic thinking, relationship building, and deep knowledge of regulatory systems that most people never bothered to learn, but that controlled every aspect of modern life. My academic journey had begun at Coral Gables Senior High School, a public school known for its rigorous academic standards and its emphasis on preparing students for professional careers in government, business, and community service, rather than just traditional domestic roles. The school's approach to education had emphasized analytical thinking, clear communication, and the kind of personal discipline that would serve me well in competitive professional environments throughout my career. At Coral Gables High, I'd excelled in mathematics, business studies, and social sciences, while also developing the organizational skills and attention to detail that would characterize my entire approach to professional responsibilities. The school's student body had included children of government employees, small business owners, and community leaders who understood that education was the primary path to economic advancement and social mobility in rapidly growing South Florida. Miss Rodriguez, my government class teacher had written in a recommendation letter that I'd found years later, demonstrates the rare combination of analytical intelligence and practical common sense that characterizes natural leaders in public service. She has the mathematical skills to understand complex regulatory relationships and the personal judgment to make sound decisions under pressure while maintaining absolute integrity. My senior thesis at Coral Gables High had focused on the role of vehicle registration systems in supporting small business development in Miami's diverse neighborhoods, research that had required me to interview DMV officials, small business owners, and community leaders about the relationship between transportation regulation and economic opportunity. The project had given me my first taste of the complex negotiations and relationship management that would characterize my government career. The research had been eye-opening, revealing how transportation regulations could either support or hinder business development depending on how they were implemented and enforced. I'd discovered that many small business owners struggled with vehicle registration requirements, not because the regulations were unreasonable, but because the system was complex and the guidance available to help navigate it was inadequate. The biggest challenge isn't the regulations themselves, one small business owner had told me during my research interviews. It's understanding how all the different requirements fit together and knowing who to talk to when you have questions. The people who succeed are those who either have connections in government or can afford to hire consultants who understand the system. This insight had planted the seed for what would become my career philosophy: that government service was most effective when it combined technical expertise with genuine commitment to helping citizens and businesses navigate complex systems successfully. The decision to pursue immediate employment rather than college had been driven by economic necessity, but it had turned out to be the perfect preparation for a career that would require practical experience and hands-on learning, rather than theoretical academic knowledge. When I'd walked into the Hialeah DMV office in 1971 as a 17-year-old high school graduate, I'd been desperate for steady work that would help support my family while providing opportunities for professional development and career advancement. Miss Rodriguez, the office manager had said during my first interview, working for the Department of Motor Vehicles requires someone who can handle detailed paperwork while also helping citizens navigate systems they don't understand. The work can be repetitive, but it's also essential for keeping our transportation systems functioning safely. Do you think you have the patience and attention to detail that this kind of work requires? My answer had been based on my father's approach to public service. Sir, my father has worked for Miami-Dade County for 15 years, and he's taught me that government service is about helping people navigate important systems that affect their daily lives. I understand that every form I process and every citizen I help represents someone who's depending on government to work correctly for them. I take that responsibility very seriously. The interview had continued for over an hour, with detailed questions about my educational background, my understanding of government procedures, and my ability to work with diverse populations in high-pressure situations. The office manager had been particularly interested in my research project about vehicle registration and small business development, recognizing that I'd already begun thinking about transportation regulation in ways that went beyond basic transaction processing. Miss Rodriguez, most people who apply for DMV positions are looking for steady government work with good benefits, the manager had observed. You seem to be interested in the actual work itself, understanding how our systems affect people's lives and how we can do our jobs better. That's exactly the kind of attitude we need in someone who'll be representing the state to thousands of citizens every year. The starting position had been as a clerk processing basic vehicle registrations and driver license renewals, earning $98 per week while learning every aspect of Florida transportation law from basic registration procedures to commercial licensing requirements to the enforcement protocols that kept dangerous drivers and vehicles off public roads. But what had distinguished me from other entry-level employees had been my systematic approach to understanding not just how to complete paperwork, but why transportation regulations existed and how different types of licensing and registration procedures could be used to help citizens and businesses achieve their goals while maintaining public safety. Within my first month as a clerk, I'd memorized every DMV form, every fee structure, and every procedural requirement that affected routine citizen transactions. But more importantly, I'd begun developing the customer service philosophy that would define my entire career, treating every citizen interaction as an opportunity to provide value-added service that went beyond basic transaction processing. Dorothy processes transactions faster and more accurately than clerks with years of experience, my supervisor had noted in my first performance review. But what's really impressive is how she uses every citizen interaction as an opportunity to provide guidance that helps people avoid problems and optimize their vehicle registration arrangements. She's already preventing more compliance issues in a month than most clerks prevent in a year. The key to my early success had been recognizing that most citizens who came to the DMV were dealing with transportation issues that were much more complex than simple registration renewals. A construction worker trying to register a work truck needed different guidance than a family registering a personal vehicle. A small business owner expanding their delivery fleet faced completely different regulatory challenges than someone buying their first car. Within 3 months, I'd begun developing specialized knowledge in different types of vehicle registration situations, allowing me to provide customized guidance that saved citizens time and money while ensuring full compliance with state requirements. This specialization had been noticed by supervisors who were looking for employees capable of handling complex situations that required more than routine transaction processing. Mrs. Rodriguez has an intuitive understanding of how our regulations affect different types of citizens and businesses, my supervisor had written in a 6-month evaluation. She can analyze someone's transportation needs and immediately identify the most efficient way to structure their registration arrangements while ensuring compliance and minimizing costs. That level of analytical thinking is unusual in someone so new to government service. One of my most memorable early successes had involved helping a Cuban immigrant family who'd been struggling with vehicle registration requirements that seemed designed to prevent them from accessing transportation they needed for work. The situation had required 3 days of research into documentation alternatives in coordination with state offices to develop a solution that had allowed them to register their vehicle properly while maintaining their immigration status requirements. Miss Rodriguez didn't just process our paperwork, the family patriarch had written in a letter to my supervisor. She took the time to understand our situation and found ways to help us meet all the requirements while respecting our circumstances. Her expertise and compassion made the difference between having transportation for work and being stranded without legal vehicles. The promotion to senior clerk had come after 8 months, recognizing not just my technical competence but also my ability to train new employees, manage complex transactions, and handle difficult citizen service situations with the kind of professionalism that had enhanced the DMV's reputation in Miami's diverse and demanding community environment. As senior clerk, I'd been responsible for supervising 3 other clerks, ensuring compliance with all state regulations, managing cash handling and security procedures, and serving as the primary liaison between the clerk operations and the DMV's licensing and enforcement departments. The position had required both technical expertise and leadership skills that had prepared me for the management responsibilities I would assume throughout my career. The supervisory responsibilities had been particularly challenging because they'd required me to develop new skills in training, performance management, and quality control while also maintaining my own high standards for citizen service. I'd approach the challenge by creating systematic training procedures that ensured new clerks understood not just how to process transactions, but why accuracy and customer service were essential for maintaining public trust in government operations. "Dorothy has transformed our clerk operations," my branch manager had noted in a performance review. "She's developed training procedures that have reduced processing errors by over 60% while improving customer satisfaction scores. More importantly, she's created a team culture that emphasizes service excellence rather than just transaction completion." The most challenging aspect of the senior clerk position had been handling complex citizen problems that required both regulatory expertise and interpersonal skills. Citizens dealing with suspended licenses, vehicle impoundment situations, commercial licensing challenges, and regulatory compliance problems had needed more than just transaction processing. They'd needed knowledgeable guidance, creative solutions, and the kind of personalized attention that had distinguished our office from larger, more impersonal DMV facilities. These complex situations had required me to develop deep knowledge of Florida vehicle law, federal transportation, regulations, and the various state and local agencies that intersected with DMV operations. I'd spent my lunch breaks and evenings studying regulatory manuals, attending training sessions, and building relationships with officials in other agencies who could provide guidance on complicated interagency issues. Mrs. Vasquez has developed expertise in vehicle regulation that goes far beyond what's typically expected of clerk-level employees, a training supervisor had observed during a continuing education review. She understands the regulatory environment well enough to solve problems that usually require supervisor or specialist intervention. Her knowledge base is becoming a valuable resource for our entire office. The transition from senior clerk to commercial vehicle specialist had come in 1976, representing my first move into the specialized regulatory management and business advisory roles that would define the rest of my career. Commercial vehicle regulation at the DMV had meant serving as the primary contact for businesses that needed sophisticated transportation services, requiring expertise in multiple regulatory areas and the ability to coordinate complex compliance solutions across different state departments. The promotion had been both exciting and intimidating, as it had required me to master an entirely new area of vehicle regulation while also developing the business advisory skills necessary to work effectively with entrepreneurs, construction companies, and transportation businesses that had sophisticated operational requirements and substantial financial stakes in regulatory compliance. "Dorothy, you're moving into an area of DMV operations that requires not just technical knowledge, but also business understanding," my new supervisor had explained during my transition briefing. Commercial vehicle clients aren't just processing routine registrations. They're building businesses that depend on transportation, and they need advisors who understand both regulatory requirements and business operations. As a commercial vehicle specialist, I'd been responsible for managing relationships with approximately 300 business clients, including construction companies, delivery services, and transportation businesses that required sophisticated regulatory guidance and personalized attention to maintain compliance while operating efficiently. The role had involved everything from basic fleet registration to complex licensing coordination to regulatory advisory services that had required advanced knowledge of state transportation law and federal compliance requirements. The learning curve had been steep, requiring me to master not just commercial vehicle regulations, but also business operations, equipment financing, insurance requirements, and the various federal agencies that regulated commercial transportation. I'd approached the challenge systematically, developing expertise in different industry segments and building relationships with business owners who could teach me about operational challenges that affected their regulatory needs. Understanding our clients' businesses is just as important as understanding the regulations, my supervisor had emphasized. A construction company's vehicle needs are completely different from a delivery service's requirements, and our advice has to reflect those differences if we're going to help them succeed while maintaining compliance. The commercial vehicle position had also been my introduction to the construction industry, as many of my assigned clients had been building contractors who needed transportation services that went far beyond simple vehicle registration. Managing relationships with construction companies had required understanding of business financial planning, equipment financing, and the unique regulatory challenges of different construction specializations from residential building to commercial, development to government infrastructure projects. Working with construction companies had been particularly educational because the industry had such complex regulatory requirements that intersected with multiple government agencies. Construction vehicles needed not just basic registration, but also commercial licensing, safety certifications, weight permits, and coordination with local authorities for special transportation requirements. Mrs. Vasquez, most DMV people just process our paperwork and send us away, one construction company owner had told me during a client consultation. You actually understand our business and help us figure out how to structure our vehicle operations to support our projects while staying compliant. That kind of advisory service is worth its weight in gold. The construction industry experience had taught me that effective regulatory service required understanding not just the rules, but also the business context in which those rules operated. A construction company expanding into commercial development needed different vehicle arrangements than one focused on residential remodeling. A contractor bidding on government projects faced different compliance requirements than one working exclusively with private clients. By 1980, I'd developed specialized expertise in construction industry vehicle regulation that had made me one of the most knowledgeable commercial vehicle specialists in South Florida. My client portfolio had grown to include some of the region's most successful construction companies, and my advisory services had helped dozens of contractors optimize their transportation operations while avoiding costly compliance problems. Dorothy has become our go-to specialist for construction industry clients, my supervisor had noted in a 1981 performance review. Her understanding of construction operations combined with her regulatory expertise has made her invaluable for helping contractors structure their vehicle operations effectively. Several major construction companies have specifically requested to work with her because they trust her judgment and appreciate her business-focused approach to regulatory compliance. The success with construction industry clients had led to additional responsibilities and recognition within the DMV, as supervisors had recognized that my specialized knowledge could be leveraged to improve service delivery for an important economic sector that generated substantial licensing revenue for the state. The promotion to senior commercial vehicle specialist in 1983 had represented my formal entry into DMV management and had required additional training in regulatory policy development, enforcement coordination, and the administrative requirements that governed commercial transportation oversight. As a senior specialist, I'd been responsible for evaluating complex licensing applications, developing compliance programs, and monitoring the ongoing regulatory performance of business clients who'd received specialized transportation authorizations from the state. The senior specialist role had also involved policy development responsibilities, as I'd been asked to contribute to regulatory reform initiatives that would improve service delivery while maintaining appropriate oversight of commercial transportation operations. This policy work had required me to analyze regulatory effectiveness, identify improvement opportunities, and develop recommendations that balanced business needs with public safety requirements. Dorothy brings a unique perspective to policy development because she understands both the regulatory requirements and the business impact of those requirements, the DMV regional director had observed. Her recommendations are always practical and implementable because they're based on real-world experience with the businesses that have to comply with our regulations. One of my most significant policy contributions had been developing streamlined licensing procedures for construction companies that needed temporary commercial vehicle authorizations for specific projects. The traditional licensing process had been designed for permanent commercial operations and had created unnecessary delays and costs for construction companies that needed temporary authorizations for project-specific equipment and vehicle requirements. New procedures I'd developed had reduced processing time from 6 weeks to 5 days, while maintaining appropriate safety oversight and compliance monitoring. The improvement had been particularly beneficial for construction companies bidding on time-sensitive projects where delays in vehicle authorization could cost contracts and business opportunities. Mrs. Vasquez's policy innovations have improved our service delivery while actually strengthening our oversight capabilities, the state DMV commissioner had noted when the new procedures were implemented statewide. She's demonstrated that regulatory effectiveness isn't about creating barriers. It's about designing systems that support legitimate business operations while preventing abuse and maintaining public safety. Commercial vehicle regulation in the early 1980s had required both analytical skills and relationship management abilities, as successful specialists needed to understand not just the regulatory aspects of licensing applications, but also the industries, markets, and operational capabilities that would determine whether businesses could successfully maintain compliance while achieving their transportation goals. My approach had been to develop deep knowledge of the specific challenges and opportunities faced by different types of construction and transportation businesses, allowing me to structure compliance programs that supported growth while maintaining appropriate regulatory oversight. Dorothy's client portfolio has the highest compliance rate in our commercial vehicle division, the chief regulatory officer had noted in 1985. Her thorough analysis and ongoing relationship management ensure that our business clients receive appropriate guidance while maintaining excellent regulatory performance that protects public safety and business operations. The high compliance rates had been particularly meaningful because they demonstrated that effective regulatory service could achieve both business success and public safety objectives simultaneously. My clients had been able to operate efficiently and profitably while maintaining spotless regulatory records that had protected both their businesses and the communities where they operated. One of my most successful client relationships had been with a family-owned construction company that had needed comprehensive transportation guidance to expand from residential remodeling to commercial development projects. The project had required developing a complex fleet management program that had included equipment transportation, worker transportation, and materials delivery coordination that had been structured to accommodate the seasonal variations and project-based scheduling that characterized the construction business. Mrs. Vasquez understood our business transportation needs better than we did, the construction company owner had said during a client appreciation event. She didn't just approve our licensing applications, she helped us plan our fleet expansion in ways that ensured we could handle larger projects while maintaining all regulatory requirements. Her expertise made the difference between small-scale operations and major commercial success. The construction company relationship had lasted over 15 years, and had resulted in additional consulting opportunities as word had spread throughout the industry about the quality of advisory services I'd been providing. The company had grown from a 3-person residential contractor to a major commercial developer with over 50 employees, and their transportation systems had been structured to support that growth while maintaining exemplary regulatory compliance. Throughout the mid-1980s, my commercial vehicle portfolio had grown to include over 500 business relationships spanning multiple industries, from construction and manufacturing to delivery services and transportation companies. Each relationship had required ongoing management, regular compliance monitoring, and the kind of personalized attention that had helped businesses succeed while maintaining excellent regulatory performance for the state. The promotion to assistant supervisor in 1988 had recognized not just my individual success in commercial vehicle regulation, but also my ability to mentor junior staff and contribute to the development of regulatory policies and procedures that had improved the entire commercial vehicle division's performance. As an assistant supervisor, I'd been responsible for managing a team of specialists while also handling the DMV's most complex commercial relationships. The management responsibilities had required developing new skills in team leadership, strategic planning, and the kind of institutional thinking that went beyond individual client relationships to consider how regulatory services could be structured to serve entire industry segments more effectively. My approach had been to combine hands-on involvement in complex regulatory decisions with systematic development of junior staff who could handle routine commercial vehicle relationships independently. Dorothy has transformed our commercial vehicle division's approach to construction industry regulation, the DMV regional director had noted during my promotion ceremony. Her combination of technical expertise and relationship management skills has not only improved our compliance performance, but also enhanced our reputation among construction businesses throughout South Florida. The transformation had been both cultural and operational, as I'd worked to change the division's approach from enforcement-focused oversight to service-oriented partnership with legitimate businesses that needed regulatory support to operate successfully. The change had required extensive staff training, policy revisions, and relationship rebuilding with industry associations and business organizations that had previously viewed the DMV as an obstacle rather than a resource. The assistant supervisor role had also involved representing the DMV in various business and community organizations, including the Associated General Contractors of South Florida, the Miami-Dade Chamber of Commerce, and industry associations that had provided networking opportunities and enhanced the DMV's visibility among potential commercial clients while building the professional relationships that would prove crucial decades later. These community involvement activities had been personally rewarding while also contributing to business development that had expanded our commercial client base and had strengthened relationships with other government agencies, legal firms, and business service providers who had become important sources of referrals and collaborative opportunities in complex regulatory matters. The networking had also provided opportunities to stay current with industry trends, regulatory changes, and business challenges that affected commercial vehicle operations. Understanding these broader context factors had been essential for providing effective advisory services and for anticipating regulatory needs that might require policy adjustments or procedural improvements. Mrs. Vasquez has become one of the most respected figures in South Florida's commercial transportation community, a trade publication profile had noted in 1990. Her expertise is sought by business owners, industry associations, and government officials who need guidance on complex regulatory matters. She's achieved the rare distinction of being trusted by both industry and government as someone who understands the legitimate needs of both sides. Standing in my Coral Gables home that April morning, reviewing the decades of professional development and expertise accumulation that had preceded Michael and Rebecca's betrayal, I'd realized that my 47-year career had created not just knowledge and relationships, but also capabilities and resources that could be deployed in ways my family members had never anticipated. The regulatory expertise, professional relationships, government access, and personal determination that they'd been taking for granted were actually going to become the foundation for teaching them the most expensive lesson of their lives about respecting the people who'd invested everything in making their success possible. Standing in my Coral Gables home office that April morning, reviewing the increasingly concerning patterns in Michael and Rebecca's behavior toward me, I couldn't help but remember how different things had been just 4 years ago. When Michael had first approached me about joining his construction business as a senior regulatory consultant and had spoken with such genuine enthusiasm about building a family business partnership that would honor the decades of sacrifice and support I'd provided throughout his education and early career development. It was a conversation that had taken place during what I now recognize as the golden beginning of our adult professional relationship, a period when Michael and Rebecca seemed genuinely committed to respecting my expertise while building the kind of multi-generational business operation that would secure our family's financial future for decades. The conversation had occurred in March 2020, just 6 months after Roberto's death, when I'd been struggling with the overwhelming loneliness of retirement and the emotional challenges of widowhood, while also dealing with the practical adjustments required by living independently for the first time in nearly 40 years of marriage. Everything about my daily routine had required painful adaptation, from making decisions about my professional future without Roberto's input to managing household responsibilities that had previously been shared between us. Michael had visited me that Sunday afternoon in my Coral Gables home, arriving with fresh Cuban coffee from Versailles restaurant and a detailed business proposal that he and Rebecca had been developing for several weeks. The gesture had touched me deeply during those difficult months when even routine activities had felt overwhelming and emotionally fraught due to the memories they triggered of collaborative planning and decision-making with Roberto. "Mommy, I've been thinking about your retirement and our business situation," Michael had said as we'd sat in my living room, surrounded by the regulatory manuals and professional documents that had been accumulating since my retirement. "You have incredible expertise that Rebecca and I could really benefit from, and we have a growing business with opportunities that could help you stay professionally engaged if we coordinated our efforts more systematically." Michael's proposal had seemed both thoughtful and strategically sound, reflecting the kind of analytical thinking that had characterized his approach to complex construction problems throughout his career. He'd clearly spent considerable time researching family business management strategies and had developed a comprehensive plan that would leverage my regulatory expertise while providing purpose and intellectual engagement for me during what could otherwise have been an isolated and unfulfilling retirement. "I know Dad's death has left you without the professional partnership you two shared," Michael had continued, "and I also know that Rebecca and I are dealing with increasingly complex regulatory situations that could really benefit from someone with your level of government expertise. What if we created a coordinated family business management system that would help everyone while also ensuring you're not facing retirement alone?" The proposal he'd outlined had seemed like the perfect solution to multiple challenges we'd all been facing. Rather than continuing to manage our professional lives separately while missing opportunities for coordination and mutual support, we could create an integrated system that would maximize our combined capabilities while providing appropriate engagement and purpose for different life stages and professional goals. "Rebecca and I have been discussing this extensively," Michael had explained, spreading out business documents and planning materials that demonstrated the thoroughness of their preparation. "We think a family business consulting arrangement would allow us to coordinate our professional strategies while ensuring you maintain appropriate autonomy and access to the kind of meaningful work that's always been important to you." The professional arrangements he'd proposed had been sophisticated and had demonstrated genuine respect for my expertise and experience. Rather than simply asking me to help with basic regulatory tasks, they'd envisioned a comprehensive family business management system that would utilize my professional-level government knowledge to optimize compliance strategies, minimize regulatory risks, and coordinate business planning across different operational areas and growth objectives. "Mommy, we want this to be a true partnership that recognizes your expertise while also providing the kind of professional engagement and family connection that will make retirement satisfying and meaningful," Michael had said. "You'd be functioning, essentially, as our family business's chief regulatory officer, using your decades of government experience to manage compliance requirements that would be much more difficult for Rebecca and me to handle effectively while we're focused on construction, operations, and business development." But what had impressed me most about Michael's proposal had been his explicit recognition of the professional sacrifices Roberto and I had made throughout his education, and his understanding that family business coordination should reflect gratitude and respect rather than exploitation or assumption of entitlement. "Rebecca and I have been calculating the total investment you and Dad made in my education and career development," Michael had continued, producing a detailed analysis that had included not just direct educational expenses, but also the opportunity, costs, and foregone lifestyle improvements that had resulted from our commitment to his success. "We realize that our current business situation exists because of your sacrifices, and we want to make sure our family business planning reflects that contribution and ensures you benefit from the success you made possible." The financial arrangements, they'd proposed had included not just opportunities for me to contribute my expertise, but also profit-sharing agreements that would ensure I benefited financially from any business growth that resulted from my regulatory management and compliance. Optimization. They'd also structured the arrangement to provide me with a substantial monthly consulting fee that would supplement my retirement income while reflecting the market value of the services I'd be providing. We've researched what construction companies typically pay for regulatory consulting services, Rebecca had added, joining our conversation with financial projections that demonstrated their commitment to fair compensation. The expertise you're offering would cost us at least $40,000 annually if we hired external consultants, and we'd prefer to keep that investment within our family while ensuring you're properly compensated for your professional contributions. The consulting fee they'd proposed had been $3,500 per month, with additional bonuses tied to business performance and regulatory compliance achievements. The arrangement had also included full access to their company health insurance plan, professional development allowances for continuing education, and a formal consulting agreement that had protected my interests while defining my responsibilities. Clearly. During those first months after we'd established our family business partnership, Michael and Rebecca had shown remarkable appreciation for my regulatory management contributions and had seemed genuinely excited about the compliance optimization and risk reduction opportunities that had resulted from coordinating our previously separate professional operations. My first major contribution to their business success had been restructuring their commercial vehicle operations to take advantage of my government relationships and regulatory optimization expertise. When I'd reviewed their fleet management situation in detail, I'd discovered that they'd been missing opportunities for licensing cost reduction, had suboptimal insurance arrangements, and had compliance gaps that had been exposing them to over $25,000 annually in potential penalties and operational inefficiencies. The problems had been systematic and extensive. Their commercial vehicle registrations had been structured using standard procedures that hadn't taken advantage of construction industry exemptions and special provisions that could have reduced their annual licensing costs by over $8,000. Their driver certification programs had been incomplete, leaving them vulnerable to penalties that could have shut down operations during safety inspections. Their vehicle maintenance records had been disorganized, creating audit risks that could have resulted in fleet suspensions and project delays. "Mommy, I can't believe the difference your expertise has made in just 2 months," Michael had said, enthusiastically when I'd presented the results of my regulatory restructuring project. "The licensing cost savings alone will pay for a new excavator this year, and the compliance improvements you developed are going to prevent problems that could have shut down our operations during busy construction seasons." The restructuring had required coordinating with multiple government agencies, renegotiating insurance arrangements, and implementing new record-keeping systems that had taken advantage of digital platforms I'd helped select and configure. The project had demonstrated not just my regulatory knowledge, but also my ability to integrate modern technology with traditional compliance requirements in ways that had optimized both efficiency and effectiveness. Michael's genuine excitement about the business improvements I'd been able to implement had been deeply gratifying, reflecting the kind of intellectual respect and professional appreciation that had characterized our relationship during its golden period. He'd asked detailed questions about my regulatory strategies, had shown genuine interest in learning about government compliance techniques, and had expressed pride in having a mother with such sophisticated professional expertise. Rebecca had been equally appreciative of my business contributions, expressing amazement at the optimization opportunities I'd identified and the systematic improvements I'd been able to implement in their previously disorganized regulatory operations. "Dorothy, your government experience has already saved us more money than we made on our first 3 construction projects," Rebecca had said, as we'd reviewed the results of my initial compliance analysis. "I had no idea that proper regulatory management could have such a significant impact on our actual business profitability. You're essentially increasing our profit margins without us having to bid more aggressively or take on additional risk." Rebecca's recognition of the monetary value of my contributions had been important validation, especially since her background in business administration had given her credibility in assessing the sophistication and effectiveness of regulatory management strategies. The success of my initial fleet management and compliance optimization projects had encouraged Michael and Rebecca to request increasingly comprehensive business management services, and I'd gladly expanded my involvement to include construction licensing coordination, safety compliance management, and government relations that had required my full range of regulatory expertise. My second major project had been developing comprehensive safety and compliance programs that would coordinate their construction site operations with municipal inspection requirements and state safety oversight. The project had required extensive research into construction regulations, safety protocols, and inspection procedures that would support both project efficiency and regulatory compliance goals. The safety compliance challenge had been particularly complex because construction operations in Miami-Dade County involved multiple jurisdictions, each with different inspection requirements and enforcement priorities. Municipal building departments, county environmental agencies, state transportation authorities, and federal workplace safety organizations all had oversight responsibilities that could affect construction projects and coordinating compliance. Across all these agencies required sophisticated understanding of regulatory relationships and enforcement procedures. Dorothy, your regulatory recommendations have eliminated compliance problems that were costing us thousands of dollars in project delays and penalty assessments, Michael had reported after 6 months of implementing my compliance strategies. And the government relations coordination you developed has improved our relationships with inspectors and regulatory officials throughout Miami-Dade County. The compliance success had been particularly satisfying because it had demonstrated that my decades of government experience had provided expertise that went far beyond basic vehicle management to include sophisticated business operations knowledge that most construction companies never had access to unless they could afford expensive regulatory consulting services. My third major contribution had been establishing government relations and permitting coordination systems that had allowed them to secure construction permits more efficiently while maintaining optimal relationships with regulatory officials who controlled their ability to operate successfully. The project had required applying my government expertise to help them navigate complex permitting processes, optimize inspection scheduling, and develop compliance reporting that supported strategic business planning and regulatory relationship management. The permitting coordination had involved creating systematic procedures for permit applications, establishing relationships with permit reviewers in multiple agencies, and developing project management systems that ensured all regulatory requirements were met before construction activities began. The improvements had reduced their average permit approval time from 8 weeks to 3 weeks while improving their success rate for permit applications from 75% to 98%. Mommy, the government relations system you created has transformed our entire approach to construction projects, Rebecca had told me during one of our regular family business review meetings. Our permit approval times are faster, our inspection processes are smoother, and we're able to take on larger projects because we have better regulatory management and government access. The government relations project had been particularly meaningful because it had demonstrated how my professional relationships and expertise could be leveraged to achieve business objectives that would have been difficult or impossible for Michael and Rebecca to accomplish independently, regardless of their construction skills and project management capabilities. During this golden period of our business relationship, Michael and Rebecca had consistently expressed gratitude for my contributions, while also demonstrating respect for my expertise and judgment in ways that had made me feel valued and appreciated, rather than taken for granted or exploited. Mommy, having access to your government expertise is like having a specialized consulting firm dedicated specifically to our family business success, Michael had said during one particularly memorable family dinner. Most construction companies, our size, are struggling with basic regulatory compliance while trying to grow their operations. We have the enormous advantage of professional-level government guidance that's allowing us to optimize everything and build our business much faster than would otherwise be possible. Michael's recognition of the competitive advantage provided by my expertise had been accompanied by practical expressions of appreciation that had demonstrated genuine understanding of the value I was providing. Rather than treating my business services as obligations or expectations, they'd regularly acknowledged the substantial monetary value of my contributions and had made efforts to ensure I felt respected and appreciated. During the golden period, our family dinners had become regular celebrations of shared business success and mutual appreciation. Michael and Rebecca had regularly invited me to share detailed reports about our compliance performance, regulatory relationships, and optimization opportunities, treating my expertise as a source of family pride rather than a burden or an assumption. "Love our family business review meetings," Rebecca had said during one particularly successful quarter, when our coordinated compliance strategies had prevented problems that had cost their competitors thousands of dollars in penalties and project delays. Dorothy's expertise gives us confidence that we're making smart decisions and taking advantage of opportunities that most construction companies miss entirely. These family business discussions had provided opportunities for me to share not just performance results, but also the strategic thinking and regulatory analysis that had informed my management decisions. Michael and Rebecca had been genuinely interested in learning about government procedures, compliance strategies, and business optimization techniques that would enhance their own professional knowledge while also improving their understanding of regulatory management principles. Dorothy has such sophisticated understanding of government systems and regulatory compliance, one of Michael's construction colleagues had observed after joining us for dinner and hearing about our family business coordination. Most construction companies never have access to that level of expertise. Michael and Rebecca are incredibly fortunate to have someone with professional government experience managing their regulatory affairs. These social acknowledgments of my expertise had been personally satisfying while also contributing to Michael and Rebecca's professional reputations within their respective industries. Their colleagues had been impressed by the sophistication of their regulatory management and had often requested referrals to consultants, not realizing that their apparent compliance sophistication had resulted from having a retired DMV executive managing their affairs. Michael had often used professional networking events to express pride in my expertise and my contributions to their business success, presenting me as an example of successful aging and professional achievement that other families could aspire to emulate if they were fortunate enough to have family members with relevant expertise. My mother spent 47 years with the Florida DMV, rising to regional supervisor of commercial vehicle operations, Michael had explained to curious colleagues. Her expertise has been invaluable in helping Rebecca and me optimize our business operations and avoid regulatory problems that destroy many construction companies. Having professional-level government guidance within the family has been an enormous competitive advantage. But by late 2022, subtle changes had begun to appear in Michael and Rebecca's attitudes toward my contributions and my role in their business operations. The changes had been so gradual that I'd initially missed their significance, interpreting small shifts in language and behavior as natural evolution of our working relationship, rather than evidence of a systematic change in how they viewed my value and my place in their business. The first warning sign had been a change in how they'd described my contributions to their business colleagues and professional contacts. Rather than emphasizing my expertise and professional background, they'd begun presenting my involvement as temporary assistance from a family member who'd been helping them get established, but who wouldn't be needed once their business had grown to a certain size. "My mother has been helping us with some regulatory details while we build our systems," Michael had explained to a potential client during a business meeting I'd attended. "She has some government background that's been useful for getting us started, but we're developing our own compliance capabilities as we grow." The subtle dismissal of my government background as something that had been useful for getting started had been the first indication that Michael's perspective on my contributions was shifting from recognition of ongoing professional value to assumption that my involvement was a temporary convenience that would eventually be replaced by internal capabilities. Rebecca had shown similar shifts in how she'd discussed our business arrangement with her professional contacts, increasingly describing my involvement as family assistance rather than professional consulting services. Dorothy has been helping us understand some government procedures, Rebecca had said during a Chamber of Commerce networking event. It's been convenient having family support while we learn the regulatory requirements, but we're planning to handle most compliance issues internally as our business becomes more sophisticated. The implication that my regulatory expertise was something they were learning rather than accessing through my professional competence had been particularly offensive, suggesting that they viewed government compliance as simple procedures that could be mastered quickly rather than complex professional knowledge that required decades of experience to develop and apply effectively. The language shift had been accompanied by more subtle changes in their behavior during our business meetings and family interactions. Rather than treating me as a consultant whose advice was valuable, they'd begun treating me more like a helpful relative whose opinions were appreciated but not necessarily authoritative. "That's interesting, Dorothy," Rebecca had begun saying, in response to my regulatory recommendations, rather than her previous responses that had emphasized implementation and strategic planning. "We'll definitely consider that approach along with the other options we're evaluating." The shift from "we'll implement that" to "we'll consider that" had been subtle but significant, indicating that my professional recommendations were being reclassified from expert guidance to family suggestions that might or might not be adopted, depending on their independent evaluation. By early 2023, these subtle shifts in attitude had evolved into more explicit expressions of changed expectations and reduced appreciation for my contributions. Phone calls requesting immediate regulatory assistance had become increasingly casual and demanding, with less acknowledgement of the complexity involved in resolving compliance issues and more assumption that I would drop everything to handle their urgent business needs. "Dorothy, I need you to get emergency permits for our Brickle project by tomorrow morning," Michael would call to say, without any acknowledgement that such requests required considerable time and effort to coordinate through government channels. "The inspector is coming Monday, so I hope you can handle this today." The casualness of these requests had reflected their assumption that managing their regulatory affairs was my primary responsibility, rather than a valuable service I'd been providing out of family loyalty and professional expertise. They'd been treating me like an internal compliance coordinator, rather than an independent consultant who'd been voluntarily contributing professional-level services to support their success. The requests had also become more demanding and less flexible, with expectations that I would accommodate their poor planning and emergency situations regardless of my own schedule or the practical limitations of government procedures. "Dorothy, why is this permit taking so long?" Rebecca had complained when a complex environmental clearance had required 2 weeks to process through the appropriate agencies. "Can't you just call someone and get this expedited? We have clients depending on us to start this project next week." The suggestion that I could simply call someone to bypass established government procedures had revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how regulatory systems worked and their assumption that my professional relationships could be exploited to circumvent normal compliance requirements for their convenience. Even more frustrating had been their tendency to blame me when regulatory situations became complicated or required more time than they'd expected. Despite their refusal to provide adequate advance notice or complete information about their compliance needs. When a complex permitting situation had required 2 weeks to resolve due to incomplete documentation that Michael had failed to provide. Initially, rather than acknowledging their role in creating the delay, they'd suggested that my cautious approach was causing unnecessary complications in their business operations. "Dorothy, we think your experience with government procedures has made you overly conservative about compliance timelines," Rebecca had said during a particularly frustrating conversation about permit approvals. "We need to be more aggressive. about pushing through regulatory requirements, even if that means accepting some risk of minor violations or penalties. The irony that their aggressive approach could have resulted in permit rejections and project shutdowns that would have cost them far more than the careful compliance procedures I'd been implementing had been completely lost on them, as had the fact that my risk management strategies had been specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of costly regulatory problems they'd been suggesting we should accept. But the most devastating aspect of their evolving attitude had been the way they'd begun treating my age and retirement status as evidence of declining relevance rather than accumulated wisdom and experience. Comments about keeping up with modern construction requirements and understanding contemporary compliance procedures had become increasingly common, despite the fact that my regulatory performance had consistently prevented problems and optimized their business operations. "Mommy, I know you have a lot of experience with traditional government procedures," Michael had said during one particularly condescending conversation, "but Rebecca and I are dealing with construction projects and regulatory requirements that might be different from what you're familiar with from your career." The suggestion that my 47 years of government experience hadn't included exposure to modern compliance requirements had been both insulting and demonstrably false, given that my management of their regulatory affairs had consistently generated superior results using exactly the kind of sophisticated strategies they'd claimed I couldn't understand. The deterioration of their respect and appreciation had reached a crisis point in March 2024, when they'd informed me that they were planning to streamline our business arrangement by reducing my involvement to basic administrative tasks while handling strategic compliance decisions independently through a professional consulting firm that could provide contemporary regulatory management services. "Dorothy, we've decided to engage construction compliance solutions to handle our primary regulatory and permitting needs," Rebecca had announced during what I'd expected to be a routine business review meeting. "They specialize in modern construction companies and can provide services that are more aligned with our current needs and growth objectives." The decision to replace my expertise with an expensive consulting firm, after 4 years of superior performance and substantial savings compared to professional service costs, had been the ultimate demonstration of their ingratitude and disrespect. They'd been willing to pay substantial fees to strangers, rather than continue working with a family member whose expertise had been generating consistently excellent results while saving them thousands of dollars annually. "Rebecca, I'm curious about the reasoning behind this decision," I'd said, trying to maintain professional composure despite my shock and hurt. "Our current regulatory performance has been excellent. Our costs have been minimal, and our coordination has been generating substantial benefits for your business. What specific advantages do you expect from this change?" Rebecca had been prepared with a list of justifications that had revealed the depth of their disrespect and their complete misunderstanding of the value I'd been providing. "Dorothy, we need regulatory consultants who understand our business situation and can provide specialized services for growing construction companies," Rebecca had explained. "Construction Compliance Solutions has expertise in commercial development and municipal relations that might be more relevant than traditional DMV experience." The implication that my traditional DMV experience was somehow less relevant than the generic consulting services offered by Construction Compliance Solutions had been both insulting and factually incorrect. My analysis of their track record had shown that their regulatory performance was significantly inferior to what I'd been achieving, and their fee structure would have cost Michael and Rebecca over $45,000 annually for services I'd been providing, as part of our family business arrangement. But the most shocking revelation had been their assumption that our consulting arrangement could be terminated unilaterally, without consultation or consideration of the legal and practical implications of such changes. "We'll need you to sign documentation, transferring your consulting responsibilities to the new firm," Michael had said, producing legal papers that had obviously been prepared in advance without my knowledge or input. Construction Compliance Solutions will be taking over all regulatory coordination, and they'll need access to our permit files and government relationships. The casual assumption that I would simply agree to transfer professional relationships and regulatory arrangements that had taken years to develop, without any discussion of alternatives or consideration of my own interests and objectives, had revealed the complete extent of their selfishness and disrespect. That evening, I'd made several phone calls that would form the foundation of my investigation into exactly what Michael and Rebecca had been planning behind my back, and what I'd discovered had been far more shocking than anything I could have imagined. My first call had been to Patricia Morales, a private investigator I'd known through government connections who specialized in asset recovery and business fraud cases. Patricia had extensive experience documenting business asset mismanagement and had been recommended by several former colleagues who'd faced similar professional betrayals. "Mrs. Vasquez," Patricia had said after I'd explained the situation, "what you're describing sounds like systematic exploitation of your professional services while planning to eliminate your involvement without compensation or consideration. Let me research their recent business activities and see what we can discover about their actual intentions and any steps they might have taken without your knowledge." My second call had been to Carmen Rodriguez, an attorney specializing in business asset recovery whose expertise in family business disputes had been recommended by my retirement legal advisor. Carmen specialized in protecting professionals from family members who attempted to exploit their expertise or manipulate their business relationships for personal benefit. "Dorothy, the pattern you're describing suggests systematic planning to eliminate your involvement while retaining the benefits of your expertise," Carmen had said. "This kind of behavior often involves assets and arrangements that can be legally challenged, and I'd recommend documenting everything while we investigate the full scope of their business operations." My third call had been to Luis Martinez, my former colleague who'd retired as Chief Operations Officer of the Florida DMV and who maintained extensive connections throughout the state's vehicle registration and enforcement systems. Luis had access to information systems and enforcement networks that could provide insights into vehicle registrations and business assets that might not be visible through normal channels. "Dorothy, I'll make some discreet inquiries and see what I can learn about their current vehicle registrations and business transportation arrangements," Luis had said. "If they're planning to restructure their business operations, there should be assets and registrations that we can identify through government channels." Within 48 hours, my investigation team had uncovered evidence of business planning and asset arrangements that had been far more extensive and vulnerable than I'd realized. Michael and Rebecca hadn't just been considering changes to our business arrangement. They'd been implementing a comprehensive plan to eliminate my involvement while maintaining access to business assets that had been registered through my government connections and expertise. Patricia had discovered that Michael and Rebecca had been researching business consulting services for weeks, had already signed preliminary agreements with construction compliance solutions, and had been systematically preparing to transfer business operations out of arrangements where I had oversight or advisory authority. "Mrs. Vasquez, they've been planning this transition for months," Patricia had reported. "The timing and coordination suggest they've been developing this strategy since at least February, possibly longer. They've been very careful to maintain legal compliance while systematically reducing your access and authority." The investigation had revealed that they'd also been researching methods for terminating family business arrangements, had consulted with attorneys about limiting my involvement, and had even explored ways to restrict my access to professional relationships and government contacts that I'd been using to support their business. Carmen had discovered that Michael and Rebecca had consulted with business attorneys about terminating family consulting arrangements and had researched legal strategies for limiting family members' involvement in business assets that had been developed through collaborative management. "Dorothy, they've been researching your legal rights and looking for ways to minimize your ability to object to or interfere with their plans," Carmen had reported. "The legal consultation records suggest they've been treating this as an adversarial situation rather than a family business discussion. The legal research had included investigations into intellectual property rights, non-compete agreements, and methods for preventing former consultants from accessing business relationships and professional contacts that had been developed during consulting arrangements. But the most shocking discovery had been Luis's research into their business vehicle registrations and transportation assets. The fleet had been structured through arrangements that I'd established using my government relationships and regulatory expertise, and many of the vehicles had been registered in ways that provided me with legal authority that Michael and Rebecca had either forgotten about or never fully understood. Dorothy, they've essentially built their entire business transportation system using your government access and regulatory connections, Luis had reported. The vehicle registrations, licensing arrangements, and compliance systems they depend on are all structured through procedures you established and relationships you maintain. They can't simply eliminate your involvement without restructuring everything, and that restructuring would expose them to significant regulatory risks and complications. The vehicle registration analysis had revealed that their most valuable business assets, including Rebecca's $78,000 Cadillac Escalade, Michael's Ford F-350 work truck, and 2 equipment haulers worth over $85,000 each, had all been registered through specialized procedures that I'd established using my professional authority and government relationships. But the final straw, the incident that would transform my hurt and disappointment into cold, calculating determination, had occurred on April 22, 2024, during what would become known in our family history as the Interstate 95 incident. I'd been experiencing severe chest pains and shortness of breath that evening while reviewing compliance documents in my home office, symptoms that had been concerning enough given my family history of heart disease that I'd called Michael to ask if he could drive me to the emergency room for evaluation. At 70, with Roberto's recent death still fresh in my memory, such symptoms required immediate medical attention, and I'd been anxious about driving myself or waiting for an ambulance that might take too long to arrive. Michael, I'm having chest pain and I'm having trouble breathing, I'd called to tell him around 9:30 p.m. I think I should go to the hospital right away, but I'm nervous about driving myself. Could you possibly come get me or meet me there? Michael's response had been the kind of casual dismissal that had revealed the complete extent of his changed attitude toward me and my well-being. Mommy, Rebecca, and I are at a client dinner at Joe's Stone Crab with the Brickell Tower developers, Michael had replied, his tone suggesting that my potential medical emergency was an inconvenient interruption of their business socializing. Can't you just call 911 if you think it's serious? We're in the middle of negotiating a really important contract. The suggestion that I should call emergency services for what might be anxiety while they continued their business dinner had been so callous and selfish that I'd been temporarily unable to respond. Michael, I'm really scared, I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my shock at his indifference. Chest pain at my age could be a heart attack. I really think I need to get to a hospital quickly. But Michael had been unmoved by my concerns, offering only the most minimal assistance while making clear that my medical needs were secondary to their business obligations. Mommy, if you really think it's urgent, you could drive to Baptist Hospital, and I'll try to meet you there after dinner if we finish early enough, Michael had said. But honestly, you're probably just stressed about the business changes we've been discussing. Maybe you should just rest tonight and call your doctor tomorrow. If you still feel bad, the casual dismissal of my symptoms as stress-related, combined with the suggestion that I should drive myself to the hospital while experiencing potential cardiac symptoms, had revealed a level of callousness that I'd never imagined possible from my own son. But I'd been desperate enough for medical evaluation that I'd agreed to drive toward Baptist Hospital, hoping that Michael would indeed meet me there as promised. However, what happened during that drive would change everything forever. About halfway to the hospital, while driving north on Interstate 95 through heavy rain that had developed into a severe thunderstorm, my symptoms had worsened dramatically. The chest pain had intensified, my breathing had become more labored, and I'd begun experiencing dizziness that had made continuing to drive dangerous. The thunderstorm had been one of those sudden South Florida weather events that transformed clear evening skies into torrential downpours with lightning and wind that made driving treacherous even for healthy, alert drivers. For a 70-year-old woman experiencing potential cardiac symptoms, the conditions had been genuinely frightening. I'd managed to pull over at a rest area near the Golden Glades interchange, but my condition had continued to deteriorate. The chest pain had become constant and severe. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I'd begun experiencing the kind of panic that comes with recognizing that you might be having a medical emergency while alone and far from help. When I'd called Michael to report my situation and ask him to come help me. His response had been the final revelation that would change everything forever. "Mommy, this dinner is really important for our business," Michael had said, his voice carrying annoyance rather than concern about my medical crisis. "The developers are ready to sign a contract for 3 high-rise projects. Since you made it to the rest area, can't you just wait there until we're finished? We probably won't be done for another 2 hours. The suggestion that I should wait alone at a highway rest area during a thunderstorm while experiencing a medical emergency had been so shocking and cruel that I'd been unable to respond immediately. "Michael, I'm scared and I can barely breathe," I'd said, my voice shaking with a combination of physical distress and emotional devastation. "I need help. I can't drive any further in this condition." But Michael had been unmoved by my desperation, offering only the most grudging and inadequate assistance. "Mommy, I really can't leave this meeting," Michael had said with finality. "You're 70 years old. You've handled difficult situations before. If you're really too sick to drive, maybe you should call 911 from there." The casual abandonment of a 70-year-old mother at a highway rest area during a thunderstorm following a medical emergency had been the ultimate demonstration of selfishness and ingratitude that had revealed the complete breakdown of family loyalty and basic human decency. I'd sat in my car at that rest area for over 2 hours, listening to thunder and rain while my chest continued to ache and my breathing remained labored, watching other travelers hurry between their vehicles and the rest area buildings, while I waited for my symptoms to subside enough that I could safely drive home. During those 2 hours, I'd called Michael 3 more times. Each call met with increasing irritation and explanations about how important their business dinner was and how they couldn't possibly leave until the contracts were signed. Rebecca had even gotten on the phone during one call to suggest that I was being overly dramatic about symptoms that were probably just stress-related. "Dorothy, you know how anxiety can create physical symptoms," Rebecca had said. "You're probably just worked up about the business changes we discussed. Maybe you should just drive home slowly and see how you feel tomorrow." The combination of physical distress, emotional abandonment, and the humiliation of being dismissed as overly dramatic during a medical emergency had created a perfect storm of hurt and determination that would transform everything forever. Sitting alone in my car at that rest area at nearly midnight, listening to thunder and rain while my chest continued to ache and my son enjoyed expensive dinner with clients whose business had been built on regulatory optimization I'd provided, I'd realized that Michael and Rebecca's business betrayal had been just the beginning of a much deeper betrayal of family values and basic respect. But I'd also realized something else. The 70-year-old woman they'd abandoned at a highway rest area was someone with 47 years of government expertise, complete access to all their business vehicle registrations, and detailed knowledge of every aspect of their fleet operations that they'd been planning to restructure without my input. That night, while Michael and Rebecca had been celebrating their business success with expensive wine and client entertainment, I'd been making phone calls that would restructure their entire business world in ways they'd never see coming. My first call had been to Carmen Rodriguez, activating legal documentation and professional connections that I'd maintained throughout my retirement. "Carmen, I need to implement the business asset protection strategies we discussed. I'd said from my car at the rest area while monitoring equipment recorded my continued symptoms. I'm activating family business dispute procedures and I need immediate legal documentation of tonight's abandonment incident. My second call had been to Patricia Morales, initiating the final phase of our investigation, while also beginning implementation of consequences that would teach Michael and Rebecca exactly what happened when people abandoned family members who controlled their business infrastructure. Patricia, we're moving to implementation phase, I'd said from my car while rain continued to pound the windshield. I want complete documentation of tonight's incident while we execute the business asset restructuring we discussed. My third call had been to Luis Martinez, activating DMV connections and enforcement relationships that I'd maintained for decades throughout Florida's vehicle registration system. Luis, I need to implement administrative challenges for several business vehicle registrations first thing tomorrow morning, I'd said. I'm documenting systematic business relationship violations that require immediate regulatory intervention. By 1:30 a.m., when I'd finally felt stable enough to drive home, I'd established the legal and regulatory foundation for the most comprehensive business lesson Michael and Rebecca would ever receive about the consequences of abandoning family members during medical emergencies. The next morning, April 23, 2024, while Michael and Rebecca had been sleeping off their celebration of business success and client entertainment, I'd been implementing the most systematic and devastating response they would ever experience. At 8 a.m., I'd walked into the Miami-Dade DMV office where I'd maintained professional relationships for decades, where I'd been welcomed by former colleagues and current staff who remembered my 47-year career and were eager to assist with whatever services I required. Mrs. Vasquez, it's wonderful to see you, the office supervisor had said. How can we help you today? I need to file administrative challenges for several business vehicle registrations that were established through my professional consulting arrangements, I'd replied. I'm implementing compliance reviews for vehicles that may have registration irregularities due to terminated business relationships. The legal strategy had been both elegant and devastating. Under Florida vehicle registration law, commercial vehicles that had been registered through professional consulting relationships could be subject to administrative review if those relationships were terminated improperly or if the business arrangements that had justified the original registrations were found to be in violation of state requirements. The Cadillac Escalade, with its $78,000 value and custom business modifications, had been my first target. As the DMV professional who'd established the original registration through my government connections, I'd had legal authority to petition for administrative review if the business relationship that had justified the registration arrangement had been terminated improperly. I'm challenging this vehicle registration due to compliance violations related to terminated professional consulting relationships, I'd explained to the supervisor handling my petition. The vehicle was registered through arrangements that require ongoing professional oversight, and that oversight has been terminated in violation of the original compliance requirements. The administrative challenge had been supported by documentation showing that the vehicle's registration had been structured using special provisions available only through professional consulting arrangements, and that the termination of my consulting relationship without proper notice had created compliance violations that required immediate regulatory intervention. The Ford F-350 that Michael used for construction site management had been next. Again, my professional authority as the DMV expert who'd established the original business registration had provided legal standing to challenge the registration if the consulting relationship that had justified it had been improperly terminated. The two equipment haulers, worth over $85,000 each, had been registered through even more complex arrangements that I'd structured using specialized commercial vehicle procedures that required ongoing professional compliance management. By 11:30 a.m., I'd successfully initiated administrative challenges for 4 vehicles worth over $250,000 total, all of them subject to immediate impoundment pending resolution of the compliance reviews I'd requested. The beauty of the legal strategy had been that everything was completely legitimate and justified. The vehicles had indeed been registered through professional arrangements that I'd established. Those arrangements had indeed been terminated improperly, and the administrative challenges were indeed necessary to ensure compliance with state vehicle registration requirements. The phone calls had begun within hours, as Michael and Rebecca had discovered that their most essential business vehicles had been impounded by the DMV pending administrative reviews that could take weeks or months to resolve. "Mommy, what happened to our vehicles?" Michael had called, his voice carrying panic rather than the entitled dismissal that had characterized our recent conversations. "The DMV is saying that our registrations are under administrative review and the vehicles have been impounded until compliance issues are resolved." "Michael, I filed administrative challenges regarding vehicle registrations that were established through my professional consulting arrangements," I'd replied calmly from my Coral Gables home, where I'd been enjoying my morning coffee while watching the local news coverage of their mysterious vehicle impoundment situation. "Since you and Rebecca decided that my professional services were no longer needed, I've implemented compliance procedures to ensure that all vehicle registrations are properly documented and legally supported." The panic in Michael's voice had been immediately obvious, as he'd realized that losing access to their primary business vehicles during their busiest construction season could destroy contracts and client relationships they'd spent years building. "But Mommy, we need those vehicles for our projects," Michael had protested. "We have 3 major construction jobs starting this week, and we can't operate without our trucks and equipment haulers." "Michael, I understand your concern," I'd replied, with professional calm. However, vehicle registrations that were established through professional consulting relationships must be properly documented when those relationships are terminated. The administrative review process will ensure that all compliance requirements are met. Rebecca's response had been even more desperate, as she'd realized that losing access to her Cadillac Escalade would prevent her from meeting with clients and maintaining the professional image that had been essential for their business development. "Dorothy, you can't just have our vehicles impounded without discussion," Rebecca had protested during a frantic phone call. "Those vehicles are essential for our business operations. We have client commitments and construction projects that depend on access to those vehicles." "Rebecca, those vehicles were registered through my professional expertise and government connections," I'd replied. "Since you determined that your business independence was more important than our family consulting relationship, I've simply implemented compliance procedures that reflect your stated preferences for handling regulatory matters independently." The immediate impact on their business operations had been catastrophic. Without access to the Escalade, Rebecca couldn't meet with clients or attend the business development meetings that had been essential for securing new contracts. Without the F-350, Michael couldn't access construction sites or coordinate with subcontractors and suppliers. Without the equipment haulers, they couldn't transport the machinery and materials necessary for project completion. Within 48 hours, the vehicle impoundment had triggered a cascade of business problems that had exceeded even my expectations for the consequences they would face. Their first major project crisis had occurred when they'd been unable to deliver equipment to a Brickell Avenue high-rise construction site, forcing them to request a project delay that had violated their contract timeline and had triggered penalty clauses worth over $35,000. Their second crisis had emerged when Rebecca had been unable to attend a crucial client meeting for a proposed Coral Gables commercial development project, forcing them to send a junior employee who'd lacked the authority to finalize contract negotiations. The client had interpreted their absence as unprofessionalism and had awarded the $180,000 contract to a competitor. Their third crisis had developed when Michael had been unable to coordinate equipment deliveries for a Miami Beach residential project, creating scheduling conflicts that had forced expensive overtime labor costs and had damaged their reputation with subcontractors who'd experienced delays and additional expenses. "Dorothy, this vehicle situation is destroying our business," Michael had pleaded during a desperate phone call on the third day of the impoundment. "We've already lost one major contract, we're facing penalties on 2 other projects, and our clients are starting to question our reliability. Can't you withdraw the administrative challenges and let us have our vehicles back?" "Michael, I'm afraid the administrative review process must be completed according to state procedures," I'd replied. "The DMV takes compliance violations very seriously, especially when they involve professional consulting relationships and business vehicle registrations. The review process will determine whether the registrations can be maintained or whether alternative arrangements are necessary." The truth was that I could have resolved the administrative challenges immediately, but I'd been in no hurry to help Michael and Rebecca escape the consequences of their betrayal and abandonment. As their business problems had multiplied, Michael and Rebecca had become increasingly desperate to resolve the vehicle impoundment situation, leading them to discover exactly how dependent they'd been on my expertise and professional relationships. Their first attempt had been to hire Construction Compliance Solutions, the consulting firm they'd planned to replace me with, to resolve the DMV administrative challenges. However, the consultants had quickly discovered that resolving regulatory disputes involving professional consulting relationships required specialized government relations expertise that they didn't possess. "Mrs. Vasquez, we've reviewed your son's situation, and we're not equipped to handle DMV administrative challenges involving terminated consulting relationships," the lead consultant had admitted during a phone call. "This kind of regulatory dispute requires someone with direct relationships within the DMV system and detailed knowledge of commercial vehicle registration procedures. We recommend that your son work directly with the professional who established the original registrations." Their second attempt had been to hire a law firm specializing in business regulatory disputes, only to discover that legal representation for DMV administrative challenges could cost over $25,000 with no guarantee of success, especially when the challenges had been filed by someone with legitimate professional standing and documented evidence of improper relationship termination. "Mr. Vasquez, your mother has filed legitimate administrative challenges based on valid compliance concerns," the attorney had explained. "She has professional standing as the person who established the original registrations, and she has documented evidence that your consulting relationship was terminated without proper notification or consideration of regulatory implications. Challenging her petitions would be expensive and unlikely to succeed." Their third attempt had been to appeal directly to DMV supervisors, hoping to resolve the situation through administrative intervention. However, they'd discovered that their requests were being reviewed by officials who'd known me throughout my career and who respected my professional judgment and integrity. "Mrs. Vasquez has filed these challenges according to proper procedures, and her concerns about compliance violations appear to be legitimate," a DMV supervisor had told Michael during an administrative hearing. "The review process will ensure that all regulatory requirements are properly documented before any vehicles are released." As weeks had passed without resolution, Michael and Rebecca had begun to understand that their vehicle impoundment wasn't just a temporary inconvenience, but a systematic demonstration of how thoroughly they'd underestimated my capabilities and my willingness to use those capabilities to defend myself against exploitation and abandonment. The administrative review process had uncovered numerous compliance issues that I'd been quietly managing for years, revealing how dependent their business operations had been on my regulatory expertise and government relationships. Without my ongoing oversight, their vehicle registrations, licensing arrangements, and compliance systems had been exposed as more complex and fragile than they'd ever realized. "Dorothy, we're beginning to understand that we made a terrible mistake," Rebecca had admitted during a phone call 6 weeks after the impoundment had begun. "We didn't realize how much our business depended on your expertise and your relationships with government officials. We've been trying to resolve this situation for over a month, and every consultant and attorney we've spoken with has told us that you're the only person who can fix this." But understanding their mistake hadn't been sufficient to restore their access to the impounded vehicles. The administrative review process had revealed that several of their vehicle registrations had been structured using procedures that required ongoing professional oversight, and without my continued involvement, those registrations couldn't be maintained according to state requirements. I appreciate your recognition of the situation, I'd replied to Rebecca's phone call. However, the administrative review process must be completed according to DMV procedures. The review will determine whether your vehicle registrations can be properly maintained without ongoing professional consulting oversight. The legal brilliance of my strategy had been that resolving the administrative challenges required not just legal representation, but also professional regulatory expertise and government relationships that couldn't be purchased or replicated quickly. Even if Michael and Rebecca had been willing to pay enormous fees for legal assistance, they still would have needed someone with my level of DMV knowledge and professional standing to navigate the regulatory resolution process. After 10 weeks of unsuccessful attempts to resolve the administrative challenges, the DMV had proceeded with the next phase of the compliance process: public auction of the impounded vehicles to cover administrative costs and penalties associated with the registration violations. The auction had been announced in accordance with state procedures, giving Michael and Rebecca 30 days' notice to resolve the compliance issues or face permanent loss of their vehicles. During those 30 days, they'd made increasingly desperate attempts to find regulatory experts who could help them navigate the resolution process. "Mommy, please," Michael had begged during a final phone call before the auction deadline. "We understand that we treated you badly, and we're sorry. We know we made terrible mistakes, and we've learned that our business can't succeed without your expertise. Please help us resolve this situation, and we'll go back to our original consulting arrangement with whatever terms you want." The apology had been meaningful, but it had come far too late to prevent the consequences they'd earned through their betrayal and abandonment. "Michael, I appreciate your apology, and I believe you've learned valuable lessons about the importance of treating family members with respect," I'd replied. However, the administrative review process has proceeded too far to be reversed at this point. The DMV has determined that the vehicle registrations cannot be properly maintained without ongoing professional oversight, and the auction will proceed as scheduled. The auction had taken place on July 15, 2024, exactly 12 weeks after the Interstate 95 incident. The Cadillac Escalade had sold for $67,000, the Ford F-350 had brought $28,000, and the two equipment haulers had sold for $71,000 and $74,000 respectively, generating total proceeds of $240,000. In accordance with my request during the administrative process, the auction proceeds had been donated to the Florida Association for Elder Rights, an organization that provided legal assistance to seniors facing family exploitation and abuse. The donation had been made in Michael and Rebecca's names, ensuring that their business vehicles would continue to serve a purpose even after their loss. The loss of their primary business vehicles had created long-term consequences that had extended far beyond the immediate operational disruptions. Without access to reliable transportation and equipment hauling capabilities, Michael and Rebecca had been forced to rent vehicles at enormous cost, while also dealing with the scheduling limitations and reliability issues that had affected their project completion capabilities. The rental costs alone had exceeded $8,000 per month, creating a permanent increase in their operational expenses that had reduced their profit margins and had made them less competitive for price-sensitive construction contracts. The scheduling limitations had created project delays that had damaged their reputation with clients and had cost them opportunities for repeat business and referrals. More significantly, the loss of their registered commercial vehicles had triggered compliance reviews of their other business operations, revealing regulatory gaps and documentation problems that I'd been quietly managing for years without their knowledge or appreciation. The compliance reviews had identified permit violations, licensing deficiencies, and safety documentation problems that had resulted in additional penalties and operational restrictions that had affected their ability to bid on government contracts and large commercial projects. "Dorothy, The vehicle situation has created problems throughout our entire business, Michael had reported during a follow-up conversation 6 months after the auction. We've discovered compliance issues with our licensing, our permits, and our safety documentation that we never knew existed. Every government agency we work with has found problems that you must have been preventing or managing without us realizing it. The recognition that my regulatory management had been far more comprehensive and essential than they'd understood had been accompanied by the devastating realization that replacing my expertise would require multiple consultants and legal advisors whose combined costs would exceed $60,000 annually. The story of what had happened to Michael and Rebecca had spread quickly through Miami's construction industry, where word travels fast about businesses that face sudden regulatory problems and operational disruptions. Within months, I'd become something of a legend among construction professionals who understood exactly what had happened and why. Dorothy Vasquez has become an inspiration for anyone who's ever been taken advantage of by family members in business. My former DMV colleague Luis had told me during a celebration dinner 6 months after the incident. People in the construction industry talk about how she turned the tables on family members who tried to exploit her expertise while abandoning her during a medical emergency. You've shown everyone that experience and professional relationships are powerful tools when you need to defend yourself. The recognition had been particularly meaningful because it had come from industry professionals who understood the complexity of what I'd accomplished and the sophisticated knowledge required to navigate government systems effectively enough to achieve such complete results. Several construction companies had approached me about providing regulatory consulting services, offering compensation packages that far exceeded what Michael and Rebecca had been paying me, and demonstrating much greater respect for my expertise and professional contributions. Mrs. Vasquez, we've heard about your background and your recent family business situation, the owner of a major commercial construction company had said during a consulting interview. We're looking for someone with your level of government expertise to help us optimize our operations while avoiding the kind of problems that destroyed your son's business. We'd be honored to have someone with your reputation and capabilities working with us. The irony that my family business situation had actually enhanced my professional reputation and created new opportunities for meaningful work had not been lost on me. Michael and Rebecca's attempt to diminish my value had actually demonstrated it more clearly than any resume or recommendation letter ever could. Michael and Rebecca's business had never fully recovered from the operational disruptions and financial costs that had resulted from losing access to my expertise and their primary business vehicles. The construction contracts they'd lost during the vehicle impoundment period had been worth over $400,000, and their reputation for reliability had been permanently damaged among clients who'd experienced project delays and scheduling problems. The consulting fees they'd been forced to pay to replace my services had exceeded $75,000 in the first year alone, while generating results that were significantly inferior to what I'd been providing through our family business arrangement. The multiple consultants and legal advisors they'd hired had lacked the integrated knowledge and government relationships that had made my services so effective and comprehensive. Mommy, we made the biggest mistake of our lives, Michael had admitted, during a phone call 1 year after the Interstate 95 incident. We didn't understand the value of what you were providing, and we've paid an enormous price for our ingratitude and selfishness. Our business is struggling. Our relationships with clients are damaged, and we've lost the best professional arrangement we'll ever have access to. But the financial consequences had been accompanied by personal consequences that had been equally devastating. Michael and Rebecca's friends and professional contacts had learned about how they'd treated me, and their social and business reputations had suffered significantly among people who valued family loyalty and respected professional expertise. Dorothy, we understand now that we destroyed not just our business relationship, but also our family relationship with the person who'd invested the most in our success, Rebecca had written in a letter that had reached me 10 months after the incident. We have no excuse for our treatment of you except our own arrogance and ingratitude. We lost not just your professional services, but also your trust, your presence in our lives, and the respect of everyone who knows what we did. The personal apologies had been meaningful, but they couldn't undo the damage that had been done to our family relationships or restore the trust that had been broken when they'd abandoned me on Interstate 95 during a medical emergency. Perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my victory had been the way it had inspired other seniors who'd been facing similar exploitation and disrespect from family members who'd assumed that age meant vulnerability and that expertise could be taken for granted. Your story has given me the courage to stand up to my own family members who've been taking advantage of my professional knowledge. An elderly accountant had written to me after hearing about my situation through mutual friends. I've been providing free tax and financial services to my children and grandchildren for years, while they've been treating me like an unpaid employee rather than a respected family member. Your example has shown me that I have more power than I realized. The recognition that my story had broader significance beyond just my individual situation had been deeply meaningful. If my experience could encourage other seniors to assert their value and demand appropriate respect for their contributions, then the difficult process of confronting Michael and Rebecca had served a purpose larger than just personal justice. Mrs. Vasquez has become a symbol of senior empowerment in professional and family situations, a local news reporter had said during a feature story about ageism in family businesses. Her story demonstrates that experience and expertise remain valuable regardless of age, and that people who try to exploit others based on assumptions about age and vulnerability might discover they've seriously underestimated their targets. The media coverage had led to speaking opportunities at senior centers, professional organizations, and community groups, where I'd been able to share my experience and encourage others to recognize and protect their own professional value and family relationships. The most important lesson from my experience, I'd told audiences, is that respect and appreciation aren't optional in family relationships, especially when professional expertise and substantial contributions are involved. People who try to exploit your knowledge while treating you as disposable may discover that you have capabilities they never anticipated. Standing in my Coral Gables home office 18 months after the Interstate 95 incident, surrounded by the regulatory manuals and contact directories that represented 47 years of professional excellence and personal dedication, I felt a profound sense of completion and validation that went far beyond the specific consequences Michael and Rebecca had faced. My career in government service had been built on the principle that expertise and integrity create lasting value that can't be easily replaced or replicated. The skills I'd developed, the relationships I'd built, and the knowledge I'd accumulated over nearly 5 decades hadn't become obsolete just because I'd reached retirement age. They'd actually become more valuable because they were rare and irreplaceable. The attempt to exploit my expertise while treating me as disposable had actually proven exactly the opposite. That my professional capabilities remained formidable, that my government connections were still valuable, and that my knowledge of regulatory systems continued to be essential for business success in Florida's construction industry. Dorothy, your response to Michael and Rebecca's betrayal has reminded everyone in our industry that experience and professional relationships are powerful assets that shouldn't be underestimated, my former supervisor at the DMV had told me during a retirement community celebration. You've shown that seniors with specialized expertise have options and capabilities that younger people often don't recognize until it's too late. The professional vindication had been accompanied by personal empowerment that had transformed my entire approach to retirement and aging. Rather than accepting gradual marginalization and decreased relevance, I'd proven to myself and others that experience and expertise could be powerful tools for maintaining independence and demanding appropriate respect. The view from 70 was indeed spectacular when surrounded by people who appreciated my contributions rather than exploited them. The consulting work I'd taken on with respectful clients had been intellectually engaging and financially rewarding, providing exactly the kind of meaningful professional activity I'd hoped to maintain during retirement. The legal vindication of my actions had been complete, with Carmen confirming that every aspect of my response had been not only legal, but also ethically justified, given the circumstances of abandonment and exploitation I'd faced. Dorothy, you used your professional expertise to protect yourself from family members who were systematically exploiting your knowledge while planning to discard you when convenient, Carmen had explained during our final legal review. Your response was proportional, legal, and entirely appropriate given their behavior. You've set an important precedent for other professionals who face similar exploitation. The financial independence I'd achieved through my new consulting arrangements had been substantial, with annual income that exceeded what I'd been earning through the family business arrangement while requiring far fewer hours and providing much greater professional satisfaction. But perhaps most importantly, the personal empowerment I'd gained from successfully defending my professional dignity had transformed my entire approach to retirement and aging. Rather than accepting gradual marginalization and decreased relevance, I'd proven to myself and others that experience and expertise could be powerful tools for maintaining independence and demanding appropriate respect. The story of the interstate. 95 incident and its aftermath had become more than just a family dispute resolved through professional knowledge. It had become a demonstration that seniors with specialized expertise have the capability and the right to fight back when their contributions are exploited and their well-being is disregarded. Michael and Rebecca had learned that abandoning someone on a freeway during a medical emergency was not just morally wrong, but practically catastrophic when that person controlled essential aspects of their business operations. They'd discovered that expertise accumulated over decades creates power relationships that can't be simply discarded when convenient. The $250,000 worth of impounded and auctioned vehicles had been just the visible cost of their lesson. The real price had been the loss of access to irreplaceable regulatory expertise, government relationships, and professional guidance that had been supporting their business success for years. Most importantly, they'd learned that treating family members as disposable resources rather than valuable contributors is a form of exploitation that can have permanent consequences when those family members have the knowledge, connections, and determination to protect themselves. Justice served. Independence reclaimed, expertise respected, victory complete. The thunderstorm that had been raging on Interstate 95 that terrible April night had cleared completely, leaving behind perfect clarity about family relationships, professional value, and the importance of demanding respect, regardless of age. Respect your elders, especially when they control your business infrastructure. And remember, sometimes the people who abandon you on a freeway during a thunderstorm are about to discover they just left behind someone with 47 years of government expertise and the professional connections to make their most valuable business assets disappear through completely legal channels. That's a lesson worth every penny of the $250,000 they lost, and every dollar was worth it to prove that some 70-year-old women don't just get mad. They get even through 47 years of professional expertise and a contact list that includes every significant figure in Florida's vehicle regulation. Industry. The view from Victory is always beautiful, but it's especially spectacular when you're 70 years old and you've just proven that experience, knowledge, and professional relationships are the most powerful tools for justice that anyone could ever need. What's your story? Have you ever had to fight back against family members who tried to exploit your expertise while showing you disrespect and ingratitude? Share it in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your biggest family betrayal into your most empowering victory. Because sometimes the best response to people who abandon you on a freeway during a thunderstorm is showing them exactly what they lose when they discard someone who controls their business infrastructure. Michael and Rebecca thought they could exploit my expertise while treating me as disposable. What they actually did was lose access to business assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, while learning that some people fight back with consequences that reshape entire family dynamics forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.